Okay, thank you. Apologize for the short delay in reconvening. So as indicated prior to the break, we're going to undertake a consultation with individual board members on some specific language changes to the glossary of terms draft. And so I would turn this over to Chelsea, I think, to take us through the proposed modifications to the draft standard. Chelsea?
Sure. We'll start from the top, and Lada has a draft up on the screen. So the changes to basic salary, which were recommended by Kirsten, are to move the note into the definition itself, so that instead of having a separate note defining basic salary as does not include, we have the definition fixed minimum amount paid to an employee for performing his or her duties, comma, excluding any additional remuneration such as payments for overtime working or bonuses. Any disagreements?
Okay, thank you.
We have a business partner. We are proposing to delete this in the glossary and to repurpose it as guidance for the relevant standard, and this would be incorporated into guidance for anti-corruption, and also will be incorporated into the revised post-comment version of the general disclosures, where it's referenced in the ethics and integrity section.
Any comments? Okay, move on.
Community development program, we have adjusted the and or in this definition. So the revised definition would be plan that details actions to minimize, mitigate, or compensate for adverse social and or economic impacts, comma, and or to identify opportunities or actions to enhance positive impacts of a project on the community. Any disagreements with those revisions?
Okay, let's move on.
Environmental laws and regulations, choosing the lesser of two evils here. We have opted to incorporate both laws and regulations. I can feel Dwight looking at me in the definition here. The original definition incorporated just regulations in the definition itself. I think we would propose to make this change for the sake of consistency and acknowledge that it is not perhaps best practice going forward. Can we live with it?
Any comments? Okay, next.
Formal grievance mechanism as addressed. We will remove this from this glossary of terms as it's covered in the first part of the glossary currently exposed for comment.
Next.
IUCN, following Daniel's comment, we would propose to take this out of the glossary and repurpose it, include it in guidance in the biodiversity standard, which is also slated for high priority review in the future, at which point this can be updated if needed.
Next.
Disagreements? Nope. Market presence, we are proposing, there's a comment from GSSB reviewer to take out the rather self-explanatory note, which we agree with. We were proposing to move this actually into the market presence standard. We also are acknowledging that it is not a perfect title for the standard, but at least we will include an explanation of what we think it relates to.
Next.
Marketing communications, there was a recommendation made to also include social media in the note for this definition, which we think is definitely timely and probably a bit overdue. Any disagreements?
Next.
Nope. Non-renewable energy source. So we have aligned in three definitions the reference to a renewable energy source as one, or renewable material as one that can be replenished, reproduced, grown, or generated in a short time period through ecological cycles or agricultural processes. So this occurs in three places. It occurs there. It also occurs in renewable energy and renewable material. We have now aligned them with input from two GSSB members to always refer to both ecological cycles or agricultural processes, because they refer in some cases to biomass.
Any comments? Okay, next.
Here's another example there where we've included or agricultural processes under renewable energy source. And that brings it into alignment with renewable material below. Line 423. Or sorry, line 421. Total water discharge, which we had already modified to water discharge. There was a proposal from a GSSB member that this definition relates only to the effluents and waste standard and therefore belongs better as guidance in that standard. We're happy to move it into guidance, given that also this one is slated for review as a priority as well. Any objections?
Next.
Training, as mentioned, we're proposing to delete this from the glossary and bring it in as guidance to training and education.
Next.
And as mentioned previously, we will retitle fatality to work-related fatality for the short term. And finally, we will move the controversial revised definition of young worker to guidance in the relevant standard. Child labor, it actually already is in guidance, so therefore we will delete it from glossary, and upon request we will add in the reference as well to the UN source in the standard. That captures all of the changes that we were presented with. Anything additional?
Any other comments? So just a question, perhaps it's a comment. So the lead-in to the glossary, is it going to be modified at all to indicate that this is the GRI use of these terms? Or have we just not made that change?
We have not made it yet, but we certainly could.
Any objection if we were to insert that this is, this is how we, glossary of terms is used in these standards, so we don't change the title of the standard, but we make it clear that it's our use of these terms to the extent that there's any question about, how we got here. Is that satisfactory?
Yes, so we will note down that we'll add in a sentence or two at the beginning acknowledging these are in the context of the GRI standards.
Okay. Any other comments with regard to this draft standard? Do I get a sense of the board that with these changes we're ready to go out for public comment as modified? Okay, thank you. So we are now moving to our next agenda item. And thank you, Secretariat in particular, for making those changes, and thank you to the board for your thoughtful comments. And I appreciate we'll have some ripple effect, I suspect, on the public exposure draft we have in the glossary 1. So we'll just have to make sure that we modify those or take those into consideration when we get to the final approval of the standard later this fall. Okay, thank you. Okay. So we're now at the point in our agenda where we are going to discuss the disposition of the remaining 18 standards that we talked about yesterday. We covered 12. And so, Chelsea, I think you're taking us through where we are on these 18.
Sure. Next slide, please. So these are the remaining topic-specific standards which were not discussed yesterday. We have 2 economic standards, procurement practices, and anti-corruption. We have 5 environmental standards, and the remainder are in the social category. We also are proposing, as was suggested yesterday, to renumber the standards based on the fact that we have taken 2 standards out of the social series, the ones that were discussed and had been merged yesterday. So we will present that in a moment in what the revised numbering looks like, so that there are no gaps in the numbering when we go out to exposure. So we have not received any substantive or any even minor comments from GSSB members on these standards since the versions which were sent out on 2nd of May. Those versions should have incorporated the majority of comments made on the Annotate platform, except for those where we responded that we made a judgment this was out of scope. I think I will turn it over to Eric to ask whether there are any further points that the GSSB wants to raise.
So, any further discussion on any one or more of these draft standards? Okay. Michael, please.
Just 2 quick points, if I may. One on 607, line 40.
Lada, can we bring that up on the screen if you don't mind? We don't have printed copies for everyone.
It says eliminating discrimination is a key expectation of international conventions as well as social legislation and guidelines. I just didn't understand what social legislation is. So it's just I just don't understand what it means.
Sorry, which line was this?
Line 40 in 607.
Is it the marked up copy that you're...
I'm sorry, Michael, which,
Okay,
which-
did it go? I was looking at,
Can you give us the heading?
it's G, background context.
Okay.
It's 4 lines down from the top heading, G, background context.
yes, okay.
So in the document that was shared on 2nd of May, it's lines 80 to 83.
I just wonder if that's an easy fix to get rid of it if it doesn't mean anything to anyone else.
So the proposal is to eliminate the word social in line 82. So it would read, eliminating discrimination is a key expectation of international conventions, comma, as well as legislation and guidelines. And so the elimination of the word social. No objection, okay?
Okay, the other one was in, and I guess this is more a question, in 619. We ask for, it's in requirement 619-1, we ask for total number of identified leaks, thefts or losses of customer data. And I guess that's carried over from G4, so I'm not sure how to interpret that. You know, if you've got, you know, one leak, but it's 500 data items, or, you know, I'm just not sure how you quantify it. I'm not asking for a change, and I realise it's brought over, but what will we do if we get comments? Someone might comment, so if I were reading that and I were commenting on it, I'd say, I'm not sure what this means. What do you mean? Can you explain it? What are we going to do if we do get comments like that in exposure? Are we going to go down the route of making changes, or are we not? Because it's not within our rules to make changes before we go out to exposure.
Okay, I think that was a two-part question.
So at least.
To answer the question, if we go out for public comment and we get public comments on any of these items, you know, that it'll be incumbent upon us to take into consideration making the changes at that time. Notwithstanding, it may alter the content of G4, because I do think that we have to be responsive to, you know, the current circumstances. In this case, it may require some additional guidance as to what we mean by that, and a further definitional. I don't want to, not a glossary of term item, guidance as to what we mean by that. This is a direct port, I think, from G4 at this point. So I don't know if you have any further comment. Chelsea?
We have on the online consultation platform, we have categorized comments, and one of the categories is about things that relate to content that are going to be prioritized for future review. So I do think that when we come to, and we'll talk about process planning a bit later this morning, when we are starting to look at the early feedback on these standards, if we are getting lots of content related issues on standards, we either need to think about whether we do need to issue them with additional guidance, which is in the mandate of transitioning to standards without needing to re-expose, or whether or not these just get moved up into the priority for review cycle. And we've already, the reason we left customer privacy separate as a standard is because we think this one is absolutely due for updates as well.
Okay. Other board members with comments on any of these proposed draft standards? Okay. So with the one change that we've just made, do I have a excuse me, a sense of the board, consensus of the board, excuse me, of that these standards are can be released for public comment? Yep. Okay. So so we're done with those 18. Now, can we have a discussion of the numbering?
Yeah, I think what we wanted to do was to approve them subject to this revised numbering, which Lada has put up on the screen. So this would affect the social series only. And what we've done, it's clean, is bring them through from G4 in order, but we have moved up different standards to make sure that we're as consistent as possible with public policy, which has already been issued for the first round of exposure. So we've moved supplier social assessment will become the new 614. The ones in red will get renumbered, but now we have consistent numbering. So if there's no disagreements, we would be asking for approval subject to these numbering modifications.
Excuse me? Stian?
I'm happy with moving them up. The question is just, what do we do in future? Let's say in future we merge Indigenous rights with, let's say, non-discrimination, and we then sit with a gap. What do we do then?
So, conceptually, yes, we would then have a gap at that point. I think just from an optical standpoint, when we're first going out with a set of standards to have gaps in the numbers, it just strikes many of us, maybe just me, as odd. But I think it is easily explained going forward that we have merged or deleted a particular standard, and we just reference that as part of the list of standards. This one has been replaced or superseded or whatever by another standard. But in the initial release, it just strikes me as odd to have gaps. But I'm open to suggestions. So Salema, you, and then Michael.
Yeah, I was just wondering about, there's a 18, and where is the 619? We are talking about this gap, right?
It's coming. Hold on.
Oh, sorry. So if there's no gap on the numbering, I'm okay with this list.
Michael?
I don't feel very strongly about it, but I must admit it's not how I'd do it. I'd keep the gaps. There will be gaps in future, and keeping the numbering will help people trace back for archival purposes back to our agenda papers, and it'll also help trace back to G4, where there was 2 condensed into 1. So personally I'd do it, but I don't feel very strongly. Personally I'd leave gaps, but yeah.
Okay. Any other comments on this? Is it the sense of the board that we should eliminate the gaps at this point? I think I see mostly nodding heads, so we'll renumber them and have the real-time changes here, Salema. Thank you. Okay, so I think that concludes our conversation and discussion and approval of the draft standards. So congratulations, and thank you all very much for your input. Okay, so I think we are ready for our next agenda item, which will really talk about the process associated now going forward with the release and the timetable and expectations with regard to the public comment period. And so I think, Chelsea, you're taking us through this? Okay, thank you.
Sure, thank you, Eric. So this is a chance to reflect briefly on the process for April and May, but also importantly to look ahead for some of the scheduling during the public comment period. So I wanted to start with, I think we had a really useful conversation with the GSSB in April, which helped us to prepare for the last part of April and publishing documents on annotate and assigning individual reviewers. We are finding it's a very new reality to be working with 30 plus documents as opposed to one consolidated document or 2. So from our perspective, we had really great participation on the Annotate platform, and that made a tremendous difference for us. Although it's a lot of comments, it allowed us to go through them all in groupings and to sit down. We sat down collectively to make decisions on how to respond to different comments and trying to be as consistent as possible across all the standards. So getting early feedback, we had almost all members participate. I think we had just 1, possibly 2 who did not. And we had every standard reviewed in detail by multiple GSSB members, sometimes many more. We did find that individual email reminders seem to help, so sorry for the spam. If you have specific things that we can do to encourage or remind you in a way that's minimally obtrusive to your working process, let us know. We are happy to use a variety of techniques. We know you're busy people.
Unannounced visits.
Unannounced visits. We did find that for our end, according to the previous schedule, we ended up with 3 days to review, incorporate, and respond to all comments on 30 documents. And that was extremely tight, and the team can tell you that that was about the maximum amount of pressure that we can put on and still produce good quality documents. So what we do need to think about is when we're turning around public comment feedback, and we're potentially going to have many more comments, plus GSSB comments on top of the public exposure comments, that we will need to build in a little bit more of a cushion, because there's quite a lot of cross-referencing and changes which need to be carried through text that's the same in different documents, references that need to be the same in different documents, structure. We might have changes that actually impact the format and the structure of all 30 plus standards. So with that in mind, I would just maybe turn it over to the group to get any observations from your end about things that you thought worked well, getting us to this point in time. We should do more of, things we should do less of, and we'll bring that into the planning for July and August.
Thank you, Chelsea. And I would just add, on behalf of the entire board, thank you to the Standards Division for recognizing it was very tight, but the quality has been well maintained, and we certainly couldn't have gotten to this point without yours and Bastian's and Laura's and Katja and the rest of the team's dedication and long hours. So thank you very much for that. So with that, there are other comments from the board with regard to process improvements that we can undertake. Kristen, I saw you.
I'm really impressed over the work you have done in such a limited time. And I didn't feel it was spam coming from you. It was some spam coming from Annotate, but that was up to me to put instructions on how often I would like to have the comments from Annotate. So that went very well. I'm also impressed over the way you have processed the comments during the meeting yesterday and so far today. Really, really good. And my only suggestion for improvement is that you have to allow yourself some more time for the next round.
And that's what we're going to be talking about, is what that timetable looks like, so as to afford the team that additional time. Stian?
I would echo what Kirsten has said. You did a great job there. It's great to see other people's comments as well, and it triggered further thoughts. But once you've been in to annotate and you submit it, you cannot go back in. That was what I found. Okay.
Yeah.
Then you need to teach me how to do that.
Yeah, okay.
Because that was really, one of the things that I really tried to go back in afterwards in some of the documents.
So I think as long as you don't hit submit, you can always go back. So
Okay.
if you hit submit, then you are closed out.
That's-
I think that's how it works. So I learned that the hard way, and so I never submitted. I just continued to add the comments. Is there a technical answer to that, or is
That sounds correct. So don't submit.
Salama?
But after the submission, you can also edit your comments. Because you can read our fellows' comments, then you can rethink about your comment, and then you can edit your comment or include a comment in a comment made by a colleague. So it's not there's no final submission and no going back and rewriting something.
All right, so I think all I would suggest is that as we get to the next phase, we send out the reminder tutorial on how to use this, and make sure that if individual board members need some help, that we will provide that. So, okay. I'm sorry? No, okay, Judy?
Yeah, hi. I think one of the things that I found quite helpful for my organizing my input into the review was simply the fact that we had each signed up and committed to reviewing a certain set of the drafts. And it seems to me that we should probably think in terms of doing something similar when the public comment period is over, and whether it means that we sign up to take a look at particular standards, the comments that come in with respect to particular standards or with respect to particular thematic issues that cut across a number of standards. I don't really know, but I think it would be helpful for us to have a similar way of helping you out in that respect and making sure that we're playing an active role in doing it as we go along, and not potentially being able to space it out over time so it's not all saved up for big chunks of time at the end.
Okay, thank you. I think you'll see that that's what we're trying to do. So, yeah. Other comments, other suggestions for improvements in terms of how we could facilitate this? Simeon?
Just one small point. I really like the way annotate works, so that we can see everybody's comment. But then sometimes we get an email request to just respond to you and the secretariat, and those were comments as well. And I realized that if we reply to everybody every time, then we'll get a lot of emails from everybody, and it's difficult to trace. But in those instances, I think to be consistent, I would still like to see what other people have to say as well. So if we can find a platform to be able to do it that way, without all the email burdens, that would be quite nice, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it was more of a timing consideration and timeliness of responding that we were seeking there. So I certainly agree with you that it would be ideal to have all that reflected in Annotate so we can all see it. But I think we were pressed on particular issues and the timeliness of it. But hopefully we can address that going forward. Chelsea?
Yeah, I think you're referring to the final questions that went out with the final sets of papers, and we can look into options for how we can either build that into Annotate or have a file on the shared drive or something where you can see each other's comments. I admit that would probably be useful. Some of you reply all, some of you reply just to Eric, and copy us. So we will look into that. The one advantage of having this be individual is that you're not likely to be swayed by somebody who goes in early and makes an extremely compelling argument. But this is completely up to you guys, and maybe actually that's the easier course of action for us. So we'll look into that if the group would like to see that.
Okay, thank you. Simeon?
I think we are not a group that's easily swayed, as you have experienced so far. So I don't think that would be a problem.
Fair point.
Yeah. Okay. Seeing no other comments on the process improvement, maybe we can go to the next piece of this.
Sure, and to go back to Stian's comment, it was a wonderful thing for us to be looking at some of the comments on Annotate, and in some cases, you had actually, with 3 or 4 of you commenting on a specific point, you had resolved it on your own through the course of adding to comments, and this actually made our job infinitely easier because we had a majority view. There was maybe a dissenting opinion and several people coming back saying, we think this is out of scope, and it takes some of the pressure off our team as well for making some of these judgment calls in a vacuum. So I think that worked really well from our perspective also. Looking up ahead, we are issuing 3rd of June as our deadline to go live with the second set of public exposure drafts. Right on the heels of that, so we will be making final changes into these documents, giving them a final proofread, updating cover sheets, templates, all of these things to make sure they're ready to go up on the platform, updating the background documents. On the 9th of June, we are due to have the next set of GSSB papers sent out, and in the current project schedule, these are due to highlight critical issues from the public comment period. Sorry, that's a bit of a typo on the screen there. We are suggesting, and I'll defer to Bastian, that instead we use that also to issue the public exposure draft of the revised work plan, which we'll discuss today, because we are, according to our due process, we are due to be publishing our 3-year GSSB work plan for public comment in June, and we have that slated for discussion as a private session later today, but we will need to have a public approval call for that. We think it's unlikely, but that by the 9th of June, we will have significant substantive feedback coming through in the online consultation platform, because it will be only 6 days after the second set of documents are released. We have a presentation later this afternoon going through the initial public comment feedback, but we have had just a trickle of actual submissions so far, although we do have quite a lot of registrations on the site. So we think it's very likely that stakeholders are waiting for the second set of documents before they submit comments. What we are proposing is that we would incorporate on the 9th of June any initial findings we have from the public comment period, as well as the work plan for public exposure, and that on the 23rd of June, when we have a scheduled call, we will discuss critical issues from public comment, if applicable, as well as the approval of the public exposure version of the work plan. On the 17th of July, we have the official close of the consultation period, so all the standards will come down off of the public comment site. We have scheduled an intensive 3-day team review process to go through standard by standard the main themes, to synthesize responses to the questionnaires, and to make an initial first cut at issues which need to be escalated to the GSSB. So minor issues around wording, clarity, editing, etc., we will incorporate and track changes. Issues that relate to the fundamental structure, and I think we're likely to get lots of comments on SRS 101 foundation standard, for example, SRS 301. I think we will likely have a trickle of comments, or substantially fewer, relating to the majority of topic specific standards, but we will wait and see. We are then proposing that we add in a new call without a previous paper to talk to the GSSB about critical issues that we have identified at that point in time. And the reason for doing that is that in the current project schedule, we don't actually have a call scheduled until the 11th of August. And if there are issues that require a decision from the GSSB in terms of the overarching structure or format of some of these standards, the earlier that we're able to get a decision from this group, the earlier we can incorporate those changes into revising the drafts. So that would allow us a few days to process feedback, and then we would be escalating key issues and explaining them to the GSSB in a way that we would hopefully be able to come out on the other end with some direction moving forward. We would then propose to either keep the call, which is scheduled on the 11th of August, to discuss any further issues coming from public comment and how we're proposing to deal with them, or, schedules permitting, we would prefer to move that up a little bit of time to perhaps the week commencing 1st of August, because on the 16th of August, which is only 3 working days after the 11th, when we're having the scheduled call, we are due to send all the revised standards and papers to the GSSB so that you have those 2 weeks ahead of the meeting on the 30th of August. So that is quite a tremendous amount of process to get through in a very short amount of time. We are, on the next slide, I have more detail on how we would propose to break these up and put them up onto Annotate in batches, but maybe I'll turn it over to Eric to talk about these possible schedule changes first.
Okay. Judy, you had a... So just a question of process. I'm not sure we can do that without some modification to our due process. Having a meeting with no papers, I'm not sure. Huh? I'm not sure we can do that. I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, we can do it, but I want to make sure that we're not in violating, something in terms of the 2-week notice and what we're going to talk about and so on. So, Bastian?
Well, as far as I interpret it, I think we need an agenda and we need a clear indication of what the discussion items are, but no papers are needed. There's no requirement for papers in advance. If there is a basis for discussion, then this should ordinarily be sent 14 days before the meeting. But in that particular case, this would be an update session on the critical issues.
So we're not being asked to make any decisions at that meeting?
I think the intent would be that there probably would be some things to get a steer from the GSSB on. I think the challenge we have is, well, one of timing and scope. So we can issue a paper with initial results 2 weeks ahead of that call based on the feedback we've received to date. But if prior consultations from other standards are any indication, it's likely we have a major spike in responses at the very final days of the consultation. And so those findings might be subject to change. But it is possible that we can issue an initial paper for discussion 2 weeks ahead of that scheduled call, and then we can provide any updates via a presentation in the meeting itself, if that would. But I think very much the intent of that additional call would be to get some initial decisions or steer or direction from the GSSB so that we're most efficient as possible in revising the standards based on your steer.
Other comments? Michael?
I'd prefer not to get a paper for that because I think it'd be incomplete and potentially misleading. So I think I'd rather just have a call with a verbal briefing or whatever you propose. But I'd also, I guess, with that, say that it's directional rather than decisional. That it's not committed for that purpose.
Okay, so I do think we need to publish our agenda for that. If we're going to have that call, we need to publish the agenda 2 weeks in advance. I'm satisfied that we probably don't need the paper because it'll be informational and directional, but not decision, because clearly we're not going to make a decision to approve the final standards until September 1st in all likelihood. So is the question, is there a preference on those dates, or are we going to circulate the dates? Because we have previously all the items and all the dates in blue we already have calendarized and set. So what's your proposal for, and I guess the question is, there's a two-part question. There's additional call, and then there's a question in terms of moving the call from August 11th up, which then says that the 2-week agenda for that one is going to go out, 10 days earlier also. So Chelsea?
Yeah, we're happy to circulate. We can circulate a doodle poll if that's the easiest and ask you guys. We can put that together today to respond on those dates. I think the other reason to discuss these dates now is that when these were set, it was quite a long time ago, and this is, at least for many people, prime vacation or holiday time, and your plans might have changed, which is important for us to note, because if you're no longer able to commit to dates that were already in the calendar and have been in the calendar, then it might be that we are better off adjusting these slightly to make sure that we have a majority able to join the calls. These are, I think, going to be quite important directional steering points for this group, and they're critical to have ahead of the 30th of August, 1st of September meeting when we come together to look at the almost final versions. So we will take as an action to put together a doodle poll later today, but bearing in mind as well, this is a time to double check calendars and let us know if other conflicts have come up. Yes, that will include the doodle on suggested moving of the 11th of August call. With alternative dates, yes. Probably 1 week before, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Lada, next slide. So bearing in mind that some of these dates might shift slightly, when you actually break down that timeline from mid-July until end of August, we essentially have 1 month from the close of consultation until the deadline to send revised standards and papers to the GSSB for discussion on the 16th of August. So what looks like quite a lot of time evaporates pretty quickly. We are proposing that on the right-hand side, we have done our best to put a process forward. We would propose that from the 25th of July to the 10th of August, which gives us several working days internally to go through comments and synthesize them and take decisions and escalate key issues to the GSSB, as well as having a call, that initial call we just discussed with the GSSB. We will then, similar to what we did in April, start to publish draft documents onto Annotate for designated reviewers in batches, alerting you when they're ready. And we will produce with every standard a synthesis of the public comment feedback as well as give you access, and tomorrow we'll talk more about this later today, to the raw comments in an organized way if you want to go in and look specifically at public comments. Then we would pull everything off from the 11th to the 16th of August and update comments with GSSB comments. So depending, that time frame could shift slightly, but similarly to what we did last time, there would be a pause in review process when we're actually taking things down, going through all the comments, responding to you individually if we didn't understand something, or in some cases, as we did before, where standards were very complicated, we went back to specific reviewers via email to get clarification. And then we would have another week of final review where you're looking at the draft documents that are sent out on the 16th of August, and we're asking for any final comments coming back by probably about the 23rd of August, which gives us 5 days or 4 days between the 24th and 29th to make final changes and to prep for the meeting on the 30th of August. A lot of this time frame really depends on the extent of feedback and the types of feedback that we get, and it's extremely hard for us to predict at this point in time. But the earlier, I think we're less concerned about making detailed changes in the topic standards or looking at wording issues. What we're most concerned about are the fundamental comments or issues with either how the new standards are structured, the usability, things that will affect the structure and the formatting of all of the documents. And those, the earlier we can get them prioritized and discussed for you to either say yes, no, we need further time, then the better off we can be to make detailed changes a bit later. So I would turn over to Eric to just maybe guide you through, are we optimistically committing to this? Are there other changes or adjustments we can make that you think will be better going forward?
So comments from the board. So I have a couple. For preparation for the August 30th to September 1st, again, looking out 2 weeks prior to that for the public exposure of the papers, how does that comport with the August 16th through 23rd review of those by the GSSB, and which papers are going to be discussed at the meeting?
So I would say similarly to how we handled this for this meeting, so the discussion papers for the public session were sent out on 2nd of May, but we allowed 1 week for GSSB to read those and come back to us with comments or adjustments which fed into what we discussed here. So any modifications here were based on comments largely off those draft documents.
Okay, thank you. The other question I would have, and I suspect I know the answer, but I'll ask the question just for clarity, which is, as we get these comments from the public exposure drafts, I presume that we'll categorize these as these are, at least initially by the standards division's assessment, a content change. Which, unless it is very compelling, such as the conversation we've had both at this meeting and at our prior one in improving for public exposure, to stay away from things that, at the best we can, that are content changes, and then the cosmetics. So we'll have a categorization and a criteria that, and I guess I would like to see what the criteria, maybe very simple, but the criteria that the standards division is going to use for the categorization of these comments.
Sure, I can respond to that, and Tamara will give you more detail a bit later today. But we are actually putting the categorization on the individual stakeholders given feedback. So when you go into the platform and you're making a comment on the PDF documents, you are actually forced to categorize your comment. Either it's a wording change, it relates to an employee worker terminology change, or there's a category for things that are content-related change to be prioritized for future review. So we are hoping that 80% of these actually are coming into us already categorized correctly. We will do some manual. It's possible people will try and sneak content-related changes in under a formatting category, but we will manually adjust these. And then the results of the consultation we presented to the GSSB with those content-related comments separated out. So they will be available to you. You can look at them, we can look at them, but they will not be in the main content or non-content related comments that we're using for the transition project.
Okay, thank you. Other comments? No? Okay. Next. Oh, Michael? Sorry.
Sorry, are you looking for comments on the timetable overall now, or is that later?
Yes.
Okay, so to be perfectly frank, I've said it from the start. I think I feel that we're being driven by time rather than quality in many ways, and I have no desire to prolong everyone's agony, but I think this is too short a timetable. If we get the sort of responses that I think we are likely to get, so I think we should have a plan B at least to have to not approve at the September meeting, but to approve at a conference call after that. Maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, because as we see through this meeting and the previous meeting, substantive issues, no matter how much we prepare, substantive issues come out at the meetings. And in my view, that's a proper place for them to come out where you can discuss. So, yeah, that would be my proposal, is that we don't plan to approve at the in-person meeting, but we rather plan to approve at a call at a later date, where we can have time to consider things that come up at the meeting and account for them appropriately. And just the other point, I'll just say it now, is this. I assume that we all recognise that if we need to re-expose, then one or more things, then this timetable doesn't apply to those things that we need to re-expose.
Correct. So I think appreciate the comments and the concerns, but I think for purposes of our planning, this is our plan. To the extent that we have to defer making a final judgment, then that is entirely in our power to do so, and we just simply adjust as we move forward. I think we'll get I'm hopeful anyway that we'll get a sense of that, in mid-July, or certainly no later than late July, as to the how substantive these comments are, and if it is going to require either re-exposure or significant dialogue. And so the backup plan has always been to, we don't have to make a decision. We can defer it and simply adjust the schedule accordingly, because no one is interested in rushing to justice here and putting out something that we all aren't very committed to and supportive of, and represent the quality that we want it to be. But I'd be hesitant to say that not have an objective, and we've discussed this extensively in the Standards Division. It is a lot of work, there's no question, and it does require dialogue and discussion, and to the extent that we have that and we don't come to a conclusion on September 1st, then we don't, and we will adjust accordingly and move it forward. So, Michael?
I think that's a different point from what I'm making. I feel in this process that there is pressure on to stick to the timetable as announced or as put down. And I think that if we're going to have that expectation to stick to a timetable, the timetable needs to be more realistic. And I think that, or more accommodating for quality discussion and amendment after the meeting. So therefore, hearing what you say, I'd still propose that we plan to have approval after the meeting, not at the meeting.
Okay. Other comments? Kirsten?
Just one concern from the Nordic Oversight Committee. When will the Standards Department have holiday? That's a worker requirement in Europe.
I don't know the answer to that question.
Never between now and 2018.
Other comments, other concerns? Do we have, Chelsea?
I would say it is possibly a compromise is that we schedule now, and we can include this in the doodle poll, a call for 2 weeks after the GSSB meeting, which can be on the calendar. 3 weeks after, which can be on the calendar for people. And then we will make a decision closer to that meeting once we have a general sense of the extent and complication of public comment feedback as to whether or not we definitely are not likely to approve anything at the in-person meeting, whether we hold it as a placeholder and we make a more game time decision. But certainly I think given September is also potentially vacation time, it's better to put it on the calendar earlier and not use it if we don't need to.
Okay, I think that makes sense. So we'll also solicit a meeting date 3 weeks, so it'll be sometime the week of the 21st or whatever it is. Bastian?
Just to add to that, we will also add proposals for the further calls during the year because we haven't scheduled any post October. The work of the GSB ends then in current planning. So
No, it doesn't.
we'll make this is covered as well in this too.
Okay, other comments on the timetable? No? Okay, next.
I think that's it for us. We will circulate that later today with the comments, bearing in mind from the conversation.
Salama?
Could you go back for yeah, I'm not talking about the agenda and the timing, but I'm talking about GSSB to review designated standards. I would to point out that I would like to review all the standards.
And we would welcome your input on all of the standards.
No,
So,
besides the environmental ones.
yeah. And at what point in this process do we sign up for the ones that we want to review? Where do we do that?
We can, once we get through the 3rd of June public exposure deadline, I think we can circulate a sign-up sheet again to GSSB members. Our starting point probably would be to ask you to review the ones that you're already familiar with, and Salema to review all of them. And then if you want to opt in or out based on others, then we would allow you the flexibility to do so. But I think having continuity to see how things evolve based on feedback is really important if we can.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on the timetable? Nope. I think we're at the end of our session then. So once again, I want to thank all of the GSSB members for their contribution and the dialogue that we've had both yesterday and today and the previous meetings. I think we have achieved quite a bit by getting out for public commentary our transition from the G4 guidelines to a set of interrelated standards. So I congratulate the board for that, and also again thank the Secretariat and the Standards Division for their intense amount of work that they've put in to achieve this. So unless there's any other matters to bring up, I'll close the meeting, and with that, thank you, and we'll move on. Thank you.